the regeneration of Fatima mansions in Dublin, and in particular we were interested in how the local community in Fatima and its relationship to the media has changed over time. So the three of us worked on the paper over the last year or so. They sent me down to Limerick to give the presentation, and we tried to distinguish our research from what we've heard from Owen, which mainly approaches the study of media and society from a political economy perspective. And this is one of the dominant perspectives in the literature on media studies. And it mainly focuses on the influence of media ownership, corporate finance and advertising upon media content and news reportage. And one of the basic claims of this theory is that, or it would lead us to think that media reportage of various topics would be not very likely to discourage government policy or social policy, because according to this view, media interests are concerned about maintaining existing relations of power and inequality in society. So it would lead us to expect that the media reporters wouldn't be critical of government policy. And then there's a second theoretical perspective called structuralism, which instead of focusing on the interests behind media reportage, this perspective focuses on it's concerned with the concept of ideology and the factors that influence news production, and in particular pays attention to the organisational routines and practices of journalists that shape media reportage. And in particular, this perspective spotlights the fact that in general, journalists tend to privilege certain sources in their work. And generally speaking, the tendency is that journalists go to official sources, to elites, sooner than they go to non-official sources and who are more of a social distance to them. So from this perspective, we'd expect that media agents and journalists would resort to official sources when they want to report about something. These kinds of sources, the official ones like what Annette mentioned earlier, street-level bureaucrats, these tend to be seen as more reliable and more trustworthy in comparison to non-official sources. And there's a well-known study by Stuart Hall called Policing the Crisis, and he drew attention to the way in which official sources tend to get advantage in terms of access to the media, and they become the primary definers of key issues reported in the media. So this is what we could refer to as the agenda-setting perspective, and we try to take on this perspective in the literature. But there's a third theory that we also try to draw on in the research, and it's called the cultural perspective. And instead of focusing on interests, as in the case of the political economy approach, instead of focusing on institutional or organisational practices and routines, in the case of the structuralism approach, this approach focuses on norms and values. And in particular, the basic insight of this theory is that there are certain cultural norms or givens that are embedded in media coverage. And there's an idea called framing that's central to this perspective, that a frame is a kind of a device that journalists use. It's a way of making sense of the complexity of the social world. Journalists tend to use kind of shorthands that we call frames to make sense of the world. So in our research, we've identified 3 different frames in relation to media coverage of Fatima, and they're called positive, negative, and mixed framings of Fatima. It took us a good while to come up with those categories. So I said a little bit about the theory guiding the research. I meant to say a bit about the background of the authors, my co-authors. Mary Corcoran has a fairly long history of involvement in Fatima, going back to the 1990s, I think, and has done research there with the local residents. And then my other colleague, Lynn Cahill, has done or is currently working in Tala in a similar capacity. And in an earlier identity, I worked in a local authority in Carlow as a housing liaison officer, and that job was about trying to improve the relationships between the local authority and the residents in a few estates in the town. And it was also about trying to, in a way, kind of challenge how the local media reported about some of the problems in the estate. So I suppose the three of us bring kind of experience of street level bureaucracy to the study. So one of the main ambitions of the research was to try to challenge the agenda setting perspective that's dominant in media society analysis. We do that by doing an empirical analysis of two different media genres. I'm only reporting about the print media. We looked at both print media and radio media coverage of Fatima. And then we're also trying to challenge a kind of a dominant view that is in lots of places, that local authority housing is socially disorganised. And we're trying to, sociologists, if one thing sociologists like to do is to take some idea that everyone takes for granted and to just blow it out of the water. And this is an idea that's taken for granted, that poor neighbourhoods are socially disorganised, and these tend to be contrasted with the kind of stable and solid middle class. So we want to try and debunk that. And another research I've done looking at the social organisation of social housing, I looked at how likely tenants are to join tenant associations and the factors that influence their likelihood of joining. And I've generally found that participation levels in public housing tend to be about 20%, and these tend to be greater than levels of participation in resident associations in private estates. So local authority housing is not often as socially disorganised as we often think it to be or assume it to be. Going through that. So we had two kind of ambitions as far as the empirical analysis goes, and I'm focusing on the print media coverage. So we were interested in whether there was any variation over time, and our time period was from 1998 to 2008 in relation to coverage of Fatima mansions in the Irish Times newspaper. And we also wanted to try then to explain any changes in media reportage over time. I mentioned those two or three theories guiding or that are dominant in media studies, and we were guided in particular by the structuralism approach and the cultural approach. And these two different theories motivated four hypotheses. It's not a kind of a formal hypothesis, but these are kind of working hypotheses that we tried to adjudicate about in the study. And the four hypotheses had to do with the content of the coverage, with the perspectivity of the coverage, with the visual imagery, and with public policy efforts. So I'll just say a little bit about the four different hypotheses. So we predicted in relation to the content of coverage that the media reported around so we looked at it over a time frame of 10 years, from 1998 to 2008, and we predicted that that in the late 90s that there wouldn't be much emphasis on positive news stories, because the regeneration project in Fatima didn't kind of kick in till the mid-2000s and late 2000s. So we predicted there probably wouldn't be much media coverage around the 1990s of a positive nature. So that was in relation to the content of coverage, and that would be more positive stories than in the 2000s and late 2000s. Then in relation to perspectivity, I mentioned earlier that media reportage tends to give access to certain sources more readily than other sources. Generally speaking, official sources tend to be privileged. So we hypothesised that in the late 1990s that the media reports would be more likely to make reference to official elite sources of news about Fatima. In other words, that if they wrote up a piece about Fatima, that they invariably mention something that a politician said, for example, or something that a city council official said about Fatima, and not to ask or not to report what the residents said. And then the corollary of that then was that we predicted that towards in the 2000s, around the time of the regeneration, that media reporters would be more likely to do the reverse. In other words, to ask residents about their opinion and to be less reliant on official sources. Then in the terms of visual imagery, our hypothesis was, again, as you kind of would expect, that in the early or late 1990s that there wouldn't be many visual imagery of a positive nature, and that this would change in the 2000s, that there would be more likely to be imagery of a positive nature. And then the fourth hypothesis was about public policy efforts. And we predicted that in the late 1990s that there wouldn't be much mentions of these things in media reportage, and that they'd be mentioned with increasing frequency as in the late 2000s. So this is a table that kind of presents some of the findings of our study, and they're basically just descriptive statistics. And we set up a contrast between, we looked at, or for this table, we set up a contrast between reportage in 1999 in comparison to reportage in 2005. And along the left-hand column there is the four hypotheses relating to the content of the coverage, perspectivity, public policy efforts, and visual imagery. And you can see that just by eyeballing the table that the findings were in line with what we expected to find. In other words, that positive media content increased in the time frame, negative media coverage decreased in the time frame. We also predicted that there would be more heavy reliance on resident perspectives over time. We also found an increase in mentions of what residents said about the estate. And then under the public policy efforts, we predicted that there would be more mentions over time. Again, the descriptive findings point in that direction. And under the visual imagery heading, we expected to be more positive imagery over time. I should say that there were only 10 photographs in the sample that we had, so but we did find that there was a kind of movement towards presenting more positive imagery of the estate in media reports over time. So I just want to go through some of the kind of findings in relation to each of the four perspectives. And we compare time 1 and time 2, late 1990s with the mid-2000s. And this is a quote from an article in the late 1990s. And you can see that we found that a lot of the articles around this time tended to be about the private troubles of particular individuals from Fatima, that these were the kind of dominant news reports about the estate. And this is an example that there was some fella in Fatima who refused permission to leave his family home. He was told he would face a fine if he stayed there. So there were plenty of examples of these kinds of reports focusing on the private troubles of individuals. And towards the mid to late 2000s, we found that there was a lower frequency of those kinds of reports focused on private troubles of particular individuals, and greater likelihood that media reports would present a positive story about Fatima. And this one is an example from the mid-2000s, talking about the community spirit in the estate. And I mentioned earlier that under the heading of prospectivity, we expected that official sources would be resorted to in the early 1990s. And this is an example of reportage that involves privileging of an official spokesperson, in this case a local politician, who was asked about his views of happenings in the estate, and this case happened to be a Labour Party spokesperson. Then in relation to later content media coverage, we found that there wasn't a complete absence of references to official elites. For example, in this piece, references is made to the Taoiseach and to the then Taoiseach and to the Lord Mayor of Dublin. So there wasn't a complete absence of resorting to official sources, but we found that these kinds of articles around this time were more likely to make mention of what residents had to say. And this is an example that one of the residents was talking about her history of living in the estate. I moved into Fatima with my husband, who had been born and reared there, and raising her family there, and so on. So these kinds of sources tended to be more likely to be resorted to as time went on. Then in relation to public policy efforts, we found in the mid-90s, late 90s, that there wasn't a complete absence of references to public policy efforts. Some articles did mention them, as this one did, in relation to the childcare programme that was available at the time. But we found that around the time of the regeneration, as you'd expect, that there were much more frequent mentions of regeneration activities in the estate. And this is an example of a mention of public policy efforts in the late 2000s, informing the reader about the regeneration project in Fatima. Then in relation to visual imagery, there were only 10 visual images in our research. This is one that is indicative of the earlier imagery in the 1990s that tended to present images of the old flat complex in Fatima. And this is one example of that. And this contrasted then with later imagery, which tended to present images of the actually regenerated housing in the estate. Earlier imagery tended to invoke Fatima's history as a drug dealing place, its associations with heroin addiction, for example. One article in 1998 made this explicit link to its past involvement or past association with heroin. The caption of one photograph stated it said that the planners could not have designed a better layout for drug dealing. Heroin has turned parts of the complex into a junkie paradise and a nightmare for the residents. We found that photographic images in the mid 2000s and late 2000s were somewhat different to this approach. For example, when the estate regeneration plan was launched in 2000, one article under the title Tenants Plan Regeneration in Fatima Mansions, it included a photograph of young children from the estate, backgrounded by one of the blocks in the new flat complex. A 2003 report about the regeneration included photographs of joyous children and a colour photograph of new residents receiving the keys to their homes with the caption, Miracle of Fatima, first tenant of rebuilt 1950s flat complex received the keys, and it depicted celebratory residents congratulating one another on their new housing environment and used the religious idiom of a miracle to characterise this. So those are the main findings of the study under the 4 different headings. So now I want to come back to the second kind of ambition of the study. I said at the start that we had 2 things in mind: to identify variation in media coverage, and secondly to try to explain variation in media coverage. And we tried to take on the agenda-setting perspective that tells us that media outlets are more likely to rely on official sources. But we think the Fatima case study is a very interesting one because it suggests that it is possible for non-elite people to challenge representations of them in the media. And so the question we wanted to try and answer is, how is it possible for residents, in some estates anyway, to challenge media reportage? And in more social science jargon, under what conditions can local authority residents challenge media reportage? And we tried to argue that there's a number of conditions that facilitate the ability of non-elite groups in society to challenge dominant media representation of them. And in particular, we highlight the influence of 4 factors. One of the notable characteristics of Fatima is that it has a very long history of community organisation. And then this goes against the claim about these kinds of neighbourhoods being socially disorganised. There's a strong community organisation in Fatima called Fatima United Group, which does all kinds of things that community organisations do across the country. It leverages resources from government, it engages in internal and external communication, it negotiates and bargains with official elites, and it engages in leadership development among the local community. And this has been a very important driver behind the regeneration initiative. And I want to just illustrate that in a minute about from reports that this Fatima group put together about their regeneration. And then a second important condition is the ability to carry out empirical research. In other words, one of the notable characteristics of the history of Fatima Mansions is that the local residents initiated empirical research about their own community and produced reports about it. And that demonstrated or spoke to the social organisation of the community that highlighted its strengths as well as its deficits as a place to live, and that helped to kind of underwrite their efforts to challenge the media reportage that had been dominant. We also think that it is important that the third important factor is the ability to mobilise resources. And in particular, we think it's important that the residents in Fatima were able to develop allies and coalitions with important, influential people, for example, in the media and in the local corporation, and to kind of win them over to their side and to bring them on board in what they were trying to do. And then the fourth thing related to that is the political opportunity structure. we think it's important that if residents are to successfully challenge media reportage, that there's an open opportunity structure for them. In other words, that politicians show some willingness to take on board what residents say, that they, and under this I think it's also important that there's an absence of people who are opposed to what residents are doing, which could undermine their efforts. So we think these are important factors that influence the ability of non-elite actors to align the way media reports about them in a way that's more sympathetic to them. And I just want to finish by giving two examples of this from the reports that the community themselves put together. There's a report that the local residents put together. It was called 11 Acres, 10 Steps. And in this report they give an insight into how they managed to challenge media reportage. Because they say that 11 Acres, 10 Steps would have remained only a dust-collecting curiosity if we hadn't done two key things. Firstly, in emphasising the importance of empirical research, we designed and produced it to the highest of standards so that it would have to be taken seriously. And secondly, we launched it to a huge national and local media fanfare so that it became the central reference for all partners. And then the report goes on to emphasise the importance of the other factors of mobilising resources. When we embarked on this regeneration journey, the report said, Fatima was in the news for all the wrong reasons: drugs, crime, joyriding. And despite the fact that many quality services were happening, we couldn't get a positive story on Fatima. And the crucial thing they say then next is that we knew we needed allies. We deliberately set out to portray a very different, more accurate image of Fatima and its residents. And those allies were, they curried the favour of media elites. For example, they were able to bring Pat Kenny's Today with Pat Kenny show to Fatima and bring it out in Montrose into a disadvantaged estate and to carry out the radio programme from the vantage point of the residents. And in the last line in that report they said, we made sure that the regeneration work was sold to the media at key moments and for key reasons. So in general we think that our research was guided by the kind of agenda-setting perspective, and we thought that this is a fascinating case study of how ordinary people, non-elite people, can work to challenge media reportage and be successful about that. And it certainly suggests that that the agenda that elites set is much more provisional than that perspective would lead us to think, and it's possible to dislodge it. So that's really it. Thank you.